Hello, everybody. Let's get started. And thanks for joining us today. I'm Lauren Kuby. I manage Stardust Center for Affordable Homes and the Family at ASU. And the Stardust Center was created to address the urgent needs for quality, affordable housing in our region, recognizing that affordable housing is critical to healthy, sustainable communities. And so we use the tools of research and education and public forums such as today's event to highlight the connections of housing to food access, transportation, and to individual and community health. So welcome. Today's event is in partnership with Island Press. It's a nonprofit publisher that shines a spotlight on crucial issues and focuses attention on sustainable solutions. We thank Jen Haas from Island Press for bringing us thought leaders whose writing lies at the intersection, not a joke here, of public safety, housing, transportation, and activism. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, ASU's David King. He is an assistant professor with the ASU School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning. He researches the codependence of transportation and land use planning, along with transportation finance and economics. And of particular interest to David is transportation policies such as parking management, street design, and microtransit, all of which integrate with land use planning. We're also pleased to have him here because he is a commissioner in the City of Tempe's Transportation Commissioner, and is a real effective advocate for safe streets in our city. David, thank you for moderating today, and let's take it away.
Great, well, thank you very much for that. I'm very excited that Angie Schmitt is able to come and give this talk. I was very excited for her book to come out and read it immediately, and I'm glad she's able to share it with everything. So Angie is founder and principal of 3MPH Planning and Consulting, which is a small firm that's focused on pedestrian safety. She's also a longtime writer and editor for Streetsblog, where she was for 9 years. And she covered the movement of safe streets and livable cities, and really became one of the country's best known voices and writers in this area. Her work has appeared, in addition to her book, she's written for Streetsblog, she's written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, Bicycling Magazine, Good Magazine, Landscape Architecture Magazine, and others. In her new book, Right of Way, which you see the cover here on the screen, it was published last August by Island Press. Kirkus Reviews wrote, in a book that will sit comfortably on the shelf next to Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, Schmidt bravely exposes the human cause to public and political indifference towards pedestrian safety. And here in Phoenix, the Phoenix region, this issue of pedestrian safety is particularly concerning, because we're one of the most dangerous places in the country to be a pedestrian. We have had the 4th highest pedestrian fatality rate in recent years. And between 2014 and 2019, over 1,200 pedestrians died by being hit by cars, by being hit by drivers. And so this is a very, very timely and very important subject. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our speaker, Angie Schmitt.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for that nice introduction. It's great to be down here virtually in Arizona. I've actually never got a chance to visit. I'm sure the weather's a lot nicer. I'm based in Cleveland, and so I'm going to just sort of explain this book that I wrote. Actually, the book, Arizona being bad at this, is actually sort of one of the themes of the book. The introduction starts off talking about a really deadly week in Phoenix where I believe 11 people were killed, and looks at some of the leadership or lack thereof in the state, uses it sort of as an example of what's going wrong. But anyway, this book, when I give people an elevator speech about it, I say it's about the pedestrian safety crisis in the United States. So this presentation is just going to explain what I mean by that, why it's happening, who's being killed, and what we could do about it. So again, pedestrian safety crisis in the United States, this is what I'm talking about. There's been about a 50% increase in pedestrian deaths over the last decade. And this is really unusual, actually, in traffic safety. The general pattern since the 1970s has been better outcomes, so sort of a decline. But this is sort of unusual and new, and it's so sort of weird, and that the first few years, nobody was really certain what was going on, and everyone sort of thought maybe it was an anomaly, but now we know that this is a sustained trend. So, yeah, this is an image I like to look that just shows how, and I think it will resonate with some of you guys in Phoenix who try to do some walking. Just pedestrians have become very marginalized, and I think it has to do a lot with issues of inequality. So I want to talk a little bit, like I said, about who's being killed. And I think like that sometimes I talk a lot in the book about the way this issue is framed in the media, which is often very harmful. There's a lot of victim blaming that happens. And I think like the media sometimes when they think about who's being killed on the streets, there's sort of this stereotype that it's like this guy here on the left, and he's a very, wired millennial, and he's maybe crossing at a crosswalk in a city like DC. Maybe he's distracted by his cell phone. And I think like that comes back a little to privilege. I think a lot of people who are in positions of influence in the media and in governments are the kind of people that do a lot of trips by driving and are just not put in the situation of this guy over here sort of on the right. And I think this is a little bit more representative, a guy, I'm making assumptions, but probably a lower income guy who's just kind of sprinting across a wide arterial road that hasn't even provided a crosswalk in this case. That's really the more accurate representation. So this is an issue that has to do with, like I mentioned, inequality and racism. We know that it's a little bit like Corona, where you would think people would be impacted kind of equally, but when you dig into the data, it becomes really clear that racism and inequality play a key role in who is harmed by this. So Black people are almost twice as likely to be killed. Hispanic folks are also at increased risk. And Native folks in particular, really high death rates, almost 5 times as likely to be killed while walking. But it's not just different racial groups. Pretty much almost a lot of the things that a lot of different identities that are marginalized are also at risk. And of course, sometimes these identities overlap or intersect. And so people who might have more than one vulnerability to this would have an even greater risk, if you follow me. So I just want to point out real quickly that older folks are one of the groups that's at heightened risk as well. You can see here, this is a Smart Growth America chart showing, here's the average, and then the death rate starts rising for people when they're as young as 50. And by the time they're 75 and older, they're about twice as likely to be killed while walking. And some of the reason for that is sort of obvious. Older people might move more slowly, have a more difficult time recovering if they are struck. But one thing I did want to say is this is a very fast-growing demographic group in the United States. Almost a quarter of Americans now are over 65, and that is expected to grow to a third in the next couple decades. So this is not a group we've been doing a very good job planning for, and B, the growth in this demographic group could in part explain why we've seen pedestrian deaths increasing. And some people like the CDC predicted as far back as about 10 years ago that the aging of the American population would lead to an increase in pedestrian deaths. Okay, so that was a little bit about who is being killed. Now I want to talk about where they're being killed, because there's a lot of geographic components to this problem. So this map, I should be really clear, because in one of the last presentations, it was clear that it was difficult to tell which states were good and which states were bad. But so I want to be really clear. The green states are the safer states in this. The 10 safest states for pedestrians here are green, and most dangerous are down here in purple. So as you can see, there's a clear pattern here, and the southeast portion of the country is the most dangerous for pedestrians, almost without exception. Delaware is sort of an outlier up here, but the reason for that is well, does anyone want to guess about why maybe that is? Does anyone want to just chime in and guess? I don't even know if people can unmute themselves. So if I don't hear something, maybe I'll just move along. But um, the reason that's the case is that a lot of places, like one of the safer places here is Boston or Massachusetts. Where Boston is. Boston is a very old state. It was developed in large part, and its streets and neighborhoods, a lot of them were built before sort of cars became the primary form of transportation in the United States around the 1940s. So cities that were built pre-1940s tend to be safer for pedestrians. And then the parts of the country that didn't see tremendous growth until after the invention of air conditioning, so that mostly developed post 1940, tend to be the most dangerous. So we have really off the wall, just terrible pedestrian fatality rates in states like Florida. These are states that were pretty unpopulated in 1940. I think there's only about 1 million people living in Florida. Trying to recall the exact numbers for my book. I think there was only about 1 million people in Florida in 1940, and now there's about 20 million. So almost all the growth has taken place during the auto industry. And the neighborhood design reflects that: wide, fast arterial streets, and those are dangerous for pedestrians. So I'm not going to dwell on that too much longer, except to say, one of the problems for this issue is that these are the areas of the country, almost without exception, that are fastest growing. Phoenix, is one of those places that's having tremendous growth, but also has a built environment that's very hostile to pedestrians. Okay, so there's also some geographic components within a metro area that I think are worth discussing. And I'm using Cleveland, where I live, as an example here, but this is these kind of trends are relevant to every metro area in the United States. So this is just an example, but I think, this is a map of racial segregation in Cleveland. And I talked a little bit earlier about how this is an issue that is related to racism and inequality to some extent. So for people who aren't familiar with Cleveland, green is areas of concentrations of where Black people live. Orange is where white people live, pretty homogeneous suburbs that are mostly white. And then yellow shows areas that are a bit more diverse. So you can see Cleveland obviously is very segregated, but if we look ahead 2 decades, and we don't have the most recent census data, I would expect that this trend would be more pronounced. But you can see Cleveland is still very segregated, but we have much more diversity in some of our suburban areas. So there's been some changes in what our suburbs look like. And that's a trend that's going to continue. They're becoming more diverse. And also there's also becoming more economically diverse. So when we hear about this issue of the suburbanization of poverty, that's a really important trend that I think is a little under appreciated. So we have about the same number of low-income folks living in suburbs now as we do in city centers. And what that means is we have more folks that might rely on walking or the bus out of necessity out in areas that really weren't designed for them. The kind of places that were originally settled, again, in that post 1940s era where we were really gung-ho on cars and everyone was going to have sort of a 2-car garage. So that puts people at risk. And now, again, back to the issue of like racism, structural racism, and how that plays a role in this. Now, we've seen sort of the racial demographics of Cleveland now compared to, these are the most dangerous streets in the Cleveland region, produced by some local groups. And you can see, just how closely they line up with concentrations of people of color where they live. And all the way going back to redlining, some of that. So again, that's a national sort of issue that we see in cities across the country. Another example I like to use is Portland. I think everyone sort of sees Portland as a good example in some ways, at least a city that has invested a lot in bike infrastructure. It's sort of famous for that. So they produced this map, and it shows traffic fatalities, all the traffic fatalities that took place over a 2-year period, 2017 and 2018. And they used the names of the victims to sort of humanize the issue, which I think is a cool use of mapping. But as you can see, they're not sort of happening at random. There's this clear concentration over here on the right side of the map. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. Again, this is typical of metro areas. In Portland, there's a big sort of demographic fault line right here on East 82nd Street for people that aren't familiar. And anything east of 82nd Street in Portland is called East Portland. So the important thing to know about East Portland is that it is lower income and more diverse than the rest of the city. So in Portland, only about a quarter of people that live in Portland live in East Portland, but about 50% of the traffic fatalities that occur in the city are in that part of the city. And if you look, there's inequality of infrastructure. That's one thing this map is meant to highlight. So what it shows here is the 30 highest crash intersections with a little circle symbol. 28 out of 30 of those in Portland are in East Portland. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit here, we talked about sort of who is getting killed and where. And just to reiterate, we have a population that's a little bit older, so has some vulnerability. We also have a population that is living in more dangerous areas, either in the southeast portion of the United States or potentially in suburbs that are pretty hostile. And then we have this other trend where we have this big change in our vehicle mix that I think's been a little underappreciated. Or at least it was when I started writing about this. I think it's better understood now. But so if we look back to around a decade ago, when we're coming out of the Great Recession, close to 3 in 4 new cars being sold were sedans. They were, like Honda Civics. Do people sort of understand what I mean by a sedan? A normal car. And then over that decade, there's this enormous shift and a little bit of growth in pickup trucks down here in blue. But there's this enormous growth in SUVs, both crossover SUVs and full-size SUVs, but mainly crossovers. And so by the most recent year, for 2020, it was effectively reversed. About 3 in 4 new vehicles sold were pickup trucks or SUVs. And sedans now are sort of, they've really gone out of style. A lot of, you probably heard, automakers have stopped even making them, especially American automakers. So that turns out to have a really big impact on pedestrian safety. It's really bad. And I'm using myself, I want to talk about why a little bit here, but I'm using myself, I'm like an average to tall woman. I'm about 5'6". So I'm using my own self for scale here. And you can see how, like a Honda Civic here on the left, if I was struck by that car, it would hit me in the legs. And then the crash ergonomics, that's probably not the right term, is that I would fall, sort of onto the dash. All of that is pretty bad. But you can see here this Toyota 4Runner. It comes to, sort of up to my chest. And so if I'm struck by that car, I'm experiencing a blunt force trauma directly to my internal organs. So I think it should be obvious why that's a lot more dangerous. And we now have a lot of data that's very conclusive that SUVs are much more likely to kill pedestrians when they're struck by them. The Federal Highway Administration says 2.5 to 3 times more likely. You're more likely to be killed if you're struck by an SUV compared to a sedan. And it's even worse for children. A child, I'm 5'6", a child who is under 5 feet, this kind of car might strike them in the head, which is a terrible place, again, to be struck. So meanwhile, while all this is happening, pickup trucks have also become just sort of ridiculously huge. I use this in a lot of, it's in my book, it's in my presentations, this image. It shows my son when he was 4, so it was last year, standing in front of a lifted Ford F-250. And you can see how that sort of like really aggressive high grille is really in style now, but creates an enormous front blind zone for the driver of this car that's especially sort of dangerous for children to be around. And there's been different studies where different groups have placed as many as like 30 children sitting in the front blind zone of a vehicle like this. It might be, the blind zone might be, probably is about 13 feet, the forward blind zone on this car. So children are often hit by vehicles like this, these increasingly large vehicles, especially backed over in the United States. About 50 children are backed over every week in the United States by drivers who can't see them, most in their own driveways, most of the time by a parent or close relative. So it's a big, big problem. Okay, I feel like I'm going a little long, so I'm going to try to rush through this. Just to walk you through the evolution of one vehicle. I use the RAV4 here just because it's the #1 selling car in the United States outside of pickup trucks. So here it is in 1996, looking all cute. It was the first crossover SUV in the United States. And as you can see, it's very small still, 2,500 pounds. It was basically a Toyota Corolla with this cute little face. It's a little higher off the ground, a little higher roof. But then you can see, looking forward 13 years, it's quite a bit bigger, quite a bit heavier, has a meaner front end. And then by 2019, we've added more, almost 1,000 pounds on the light end. And again, much meaner front end. That's the trend with cars, sort of this high grille. So the combination of those things is pretty deadly. So shifting gears again, now I know that's all very, very sad. It's kind of a downer. I just want to talk about some solutions, some things that seem to work, and how we can address this with design. So this is an example. I like to use Queens Boulevard in New York City. They used to call this the Boulevard of Death in New York. 189 people were killed on this road between 1996 and 2014. So they would have as many as a dozen deaths on this road a year. And that's actually, one thing I want to say is it's actually not that unusual in cities for one street or a small handful of streets to be really disproportionate killers. And often they're this kind of street, we call this a suburban arterial, so wide, fast traffic, a lot of lanes, and especially, Queens, this is a very densely populated neighborhood, but especially corridors that, have a mix of housing, especially low-income housing and retail, can be really dangerous. So, but anyway, in 2014, the city decided to address it, and they only spent $4 million. This is called a road diet, what they did here. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar. This outer lane is supposed to be a sidewalk. They just painted the road and added these bollards, and they built this protected bike lane. And immediately, that was really effective. It was several years. So they're going from having as many as 16 deaths a year on this road overnight after spending $4 million to having none, to having zero. There have been a couple deaths a few years later. There have been 1 or 2 deaths, but tremendous improvement from this little investment. Another example I like to use, New York has been more aggressive in tackling these kind of issues in a lot of places. So one of the features they use here is called a pedestrian leading interval. And what all that means is retiming the traffic signal so that pedestrians have a few seconds head start on traffic. They get the walk signal before the cars get the go ahead to start making their turns. And what that means is pedestrians are sort of out in the middle of the intersection, hopefully, before cars start turning, especially making those left turns, which are really dangerous. They also have included this, they call this the hardened center line. All they really did was stick a few bollards there in the center line. And what that does is it forces drivers to make a little bit sharper, a little bit slower left turn instead of a very wide, fast one. So this is a really cheap and effective sort of treatment. It only costs New York about $1,200 per intersection to do this, and they've done it at thousands of intersections. And they say it's helped produce a 40% reduction in pedestrian deaths, or it might be deaths and injuries. Another thing I wanted to discuss was street lighting a little bit. Does anyone want to chime in? I don't know if you guys are able to unmute yourself, but if you are, does anyone want to chime in, and can anyone name these cities? I'm just going to assume you guys can't, but I wanted to throw that out there. But anyway.
Yes, Angie, they can't chat. I mean, they're putting things in the chat, so I'm just directing it to you in the chat.
Oh, okay. Oh, in the chat. I'm sorry. Can you read me what they said? Because I'm sharing my screen.
Oh, sure.
Yes.
So the city
Ryan
Phoenix
got
uses.
it. Ryan nailed it. Even got Toledo. That's right. So this is Detroit. This is Toledo, but we're not going to talk about Toledo. But that is where I'm from originally. This is Detroit, and this is Cleveland, where I live. And this was shot from space, obviously at night. And one thing I wanted you to notice about Detroit is how it's a little bluer hue than Cleveland down here at the bottom. So street lighting is a really important issue with pedestrian safety. And I want to talk about that for a little. And Detroit I use as a good example. So Detroit did a survey somewhere around this time, 2011, 2012, 2013, and they discovered that about 40% of their streetlights weren't working. They were broken for whatever reason, they weren't functioning. So they decided to do something about that, and they issued $185 million in bonds, and they got all their streetlights working. They updated them and made them LED. So that's why they looked bluer than Cleveland in that photo, which is an energy saving thing as well, and a benefit. So between 2014 and 2016, they got all their streetlights working and converted them to LED. So I just wanted to point out, here's what happens with pedestrian fatalities once they get those lights working. Because again, about 75% of pedestrian fatalities occur at night. So lighting is a really important issue that I think's been a little underappreciated. And I think, again, that goes back to sort of privilege. I think a lot of people, myself included, who are people who are in officials in media or government, sort of come at this from a little bit of a privileged perspective, and can just sort of expect that streetlights will work in their neighborhood. But that's not the case for everyone. So in Detroit, they spend these 2 years updating all their streetlights, and then immediately once they get those working, you can see what happens. Pedestrian deaths in just a couple years overnight fell 35%. And this graph's a little bit hard to read, but this part at the top, this blue part, shows deaths that occur in dark, unlighted conditions. And you can see it's as high as 25 or 26 people being killed a year in dark, unlighted places. And then once this project is completed, that is almost completely eliminated. It falls to just one. So Detroit's doing some other cool things. I use Detroit as a good example. I think this is, they're planning this year to add 4,500 speed humps for just $11.5 million. Very cost-effective way to address this, because one of the key things for pedestrian safety is the speed people are struck at. If we're able to reduce vehicle speeds, even just a few miles per hour, it can really make a big difference on the survival rates for pedestrians if they're struck. So I'm wrapping up now. This is my final slide. I just want to make a couple points to conclude. And I use this is called a pedestrian refuge island. And I think this is like, we have these in a lot of places. I don't think it's considered a very sexy design feature, but they're inexpensive. This is a nice one that's landscaped, but they can be constructed for as little as a few $1,000s. And they're not controversial. They're recommended by the Federal Highway Administration. They say they reduce pedestrian collisions 35 to 40%. Also, this one doesn't really take any right away from cars. So it's not probably gonna spark a big war on cars type of complaints or political issue. But I think this is the type of thing, these small scale interventions are the kind of thing we need to address this problem. And I think, again, going back to privilege, I think part of the reason we haven't seen more of this is because a lot of people who are in positions of authority just are not put in this position where they're having to sprint for their life across a very dangerous street or wait at a bus that's a bus stop that's a pole in the ground next to 45-mile-an-hour traffic. So we haven't done a very good job considering folks like that's needs and ensuring their safety. So I think, there's plenty of design solutions. We don't sort of, the issue isn't that we lack design solutions. It's more sort of that we lack the will. There also are some sort of institutional challenges from the federal government and the engineering profession that need to be addressed that I talk about in my book. But that's sort of what I'm trying to do by writing the book and giving these talks, is sort of raise the profile of this issue, because I think, again, really the problem is a lack of will and attention, not a lack of solutions available to us. And just finally, a quick plug for the book. If you do want to pick it up, you can get it through the publisher right there at that website if you want, and you can have a 20% discount. I think that's at least 20% now, maybe 25 or higher, by using my last name. So thanks, and I think we're gonna move on and do questions now.
Great, thank you very much for that. I thought that was awesome. We have a lot of activity in the chat in terms of questions to ask. There's a couple of quick questions, and then I'll have something little bit bigger for you. One of the attendees was wondering if you could explain what the PDI scores are a bit more. You had your map with the green and the purple states.
Yeah, I can.
Just explain what that is.
So that's basically just Smart Growth America developed like a methodology that they thought would measure pedestrian safety, and they used it's sort of an estimate. They used walk commuting rates, I think, from the census to try and normalize for the number of pedestrians in an area. And then they looked at like fatalities per 100,000. So it's a combination of, it's meant to be an analysis that controls to some extent for the number of pedestrians, and then singles out the most dangerous using that. And the actual data we have about fatalities, if that makes sense. And I don't know that it's a perfect methodology, but that's what they use.
Okay, that makes sense. So sort of a big picture question that I have. One of the key takeaways from your work that I have is that we have a real problem with vehicle size. So we have a problem with vehicle size, we have a problem with speed. Speed we can address through infrastructure, we can address through enforcement. There's other things that we can do about speed. But so I come at this from a city plan perspective. And I'm very interested in local transport policy and what can we do to make our cities better. And I'm sort of wondering, from perspective, you've been steeped in this for a few years, what can we do to actually influence vehicle size? Vehicle size is not an exogenous thing, but we tend to build our suburban streets based on the size of a fire truck. You know, we design our streets to accommodate larger and larger cars. What do you think we should be doing so that we can try and shrink those vehicles down a little bit?
So again, I think, first of all, there has not even been very much attention to this. It's sort of happened slow, then fast. And I think, it's been very normalized. And that's why I use that one photo of my son. I've gotten a lot of people love that photo, and I've shared it a lot because I think it does sort of highlight kind of the absurdity of it and the safety issues. So we have a long way to go in even building awareness of the problems with that. And then there's the issue of the demographic groups that love large pickup trucks tend to be really powerful. So nobody really wants to challenge the kind of people that really like large pickup trucks politically, I don't think. And in addition, large pickup trucks and large SUVs and even crossover SUVs are enormously profitable for auto companies, especially American auto companies. So like one thing I talk about in the book is a company like Toyota, for example, or Ford, if they're selling a RAV4 and originally it's based on the body of the Corolla, they can mark up a crossover SUV as much as $10,000 to $15,000 more than the car design it's based on. And all that almost becomes profit because SUVs are really not much more expensive to make than cars. So this has really been this enormous cash cow for auto companies, especially American auto companies, who are more invested in pickups and SUVs compared to foreign auto companies that do more business around the world. So it's a very difficult political problem. And I don't even, I would love to see it go out of style, but I think we have to start smaller than that. And one thing I would love to see is so we have this organization, we have this federal agency, NHTSA, that's responsible for regulating auto safety. And they're the ones that say your car has to have anti-lock brakes and a seatbelt and airbags, etc. They've never required any vehicle safety rules to protect people outside of cars. And that's a big problem. And I'm hopeful that we'll see that shift in this new presidential administration we have. But one thing I would like to see is if you have a Ford F-250 that has a 17-foot forward blind zone, maybe it should be required to have automatic pedestrian detection. And what that means is the front of the car has sensors that can detect if a person is standing in front of it and automatically brake. So that's the kind of thing I'm a little bit more hopeful about than addressing the very large size of cars have gotten, at least at this point. I mean, maybe if we could work with some environmentalists. There was pushback during the previous, there was a earlier sort of SUV craze in the early 2000s, and there was pushback from environmentalists. There was some public pushback back then, but it's been very muted this time. And you even see environmentalists sort of embracing bigger cars a lot of times now. So it's a very difficult political problem is the long and short. And I think there's lower hanging fruit that we could use to address some of these safety problems that are a little more limited.
Great. So another question that came in, and I know that you've written about this a bit. It's not a focus of your book, but one of the attendees was asking about: are you referring to traffic deaths due to intentional killing with a car, or the crashes and the accidents? And I know you've written some about sort of this increase in vehicular violence that has come along with some political affiliation. Do you see any change in sort of the intentionality of traffic violence, or is this simply explained by people not paying attention to where they're driving?
So it was really alarming over the summer during the Black Lives Matter protests, how often we saw vehicles being used as weapons and how often that was excused or even celebrated by political officials in certain cases. I talked to a guy, a terrorism expert, who told me during July, during the months where the George Floyd protests were most active, that there was happening at one vehicular attack happening on average a day. And we saw even the president, Trump, sort of cheering that caravan of pickup trucks that tried to run Joe Biden's bus, campaign bus off the road. So that was really, for me, pretty frightening and appalling. And I do think was sort of, again, the response to it was kind of muted. I do think there's been a lot of normalization and a lot of joking about vehicular violence that on the right wing, and that it's really dangerous. It's really dangerous and really sad and shocking. But if you look at there actually is, there's people that have looked at the psychology of some of these bigger vehicles, including the automakers back in the early 2000s. They have sort of tapped into, with some of these vehicle designs that are so violent looking and so macho and aggressive, they have sort of tapped into this sort of cruel instincts people have. And it's a little bit based on fear. So they were studying this among people and using it to sell cars. And one thing they found was that people like the idea of being able to run people over. Like they feel like the world is very unsafe, and that they see that as a positive. If someone was threatening them somehow, that with their big SUV, they could run them over. It's really sort of upsetting. I think there's like a lot of cruelty in all this, and it's tied to wider trends with what's happening politically and socially.
So it's sort of another big picture question, through your research and doing this and giving these talks and working with people across the country, what is resonating with local officials? What really are the compelling arguments that those of us who would like safer streets, what should we be focused on at the local level? What should we be going after? And related to that, what's the role of police enforcement in the context of safe streets? Because as you know very well, police enforcement carries with it an additional set of biases and disproportionate actions against Black and Latinos. And I guess, so how do you negotiate all these? So what are the best practices, the most compelling arguments that you've seen that have been successful? And then how do we balance these needs of policing as we're working for safer streets?
Yeah, good question. One thing I like at the local level, one thing I like at it as a tool is this idea of a walk audit or a pedestrian safety audit. And that's basically this public process where you get maybe some city council members, you get a bunch of stakeholders, maybe some business owners, sometimes the police are involved, maybe your head of public works or planning comes, and you actually walk a road and also talk to people who use the road. I think a lot of these issues are very hyper local. So in some places the problem might be lighting, in some places the problem might be missing curb ramps. There's different issues in different places. So I think that's sort of a good tool to sort of build compassion and make sure you're getting the right kind of feedback from folks. I do like the idea of, like I mentioned, those leading pedestrian intervals. I think that there's definitely a need for more crosswalks in Phoenix, but a regular unsignalized crosswalk in the middle of like a 6-lane high-speed arterial is not gonna do it for you. A lot of times, they need to be placed really carefully. There need to be additional elements like a pedestrian refuge island, or I know you guys use hawk signals sometimes there. So what's resonating with local officials? I don't know that I have all the answers, to what's going to work politically. I do think that there's some groups forming. New York is one of the places where they have these groups called Families for Safe Streets and I write about that in the book. They're victims, so people who have lost family members or loved ones or been injured in traffic crashes, and having those folks sort of be front and center, telling their stories, I think can be powerful. I think like we need to, when someone is killed, how we react is really important. If someone in Phoenix dies and it's 2 lines in the newspaper that blame that person and everyone forgets about it the next day, we're not gonna get anywhere with resolving this problem. If someone is killed, first of all, that's really tragic. And it's also an opportunity to highlight the problem and demand real solutions. So that's one thing I would say. And in addition, I mean, the issue of, we could go on for a long time about enforcement, and I think I'm still trying to figure out the answer to that question. We have very, very serious issues with racial bias and violence, race-based violence with police, and it does make everyone very apprehensive about recommending enforcement as a solution to this. And one thing I would say, and I was just saying online, is that in my book, I interviewed some of the leaders of Vision Zero, some of the folks charged with implementing Vision Zero in Sweden, which, in case people don't know, Sweden has a philosophy about traffic deaths that no traffic deaths are acceptable, and they aim for, their goal is zero traffic deaths. It's called Vision Zero. They have this whole system, safe systems approach that focuses on not on individual behavior, but on creating a system where even if people make mistakes or mess up, they're not killed or injured. So I talked to folks there for the book, and they actually told me they don't consider enforcement part of Vision Zero. They don't really think it's very effective, and they're very focused on design. So changing the road design to limit speeds, especially, so their big focus in an urban area would be limiting the speeds cars could go, so that pedestrians, if they are struck, are not killed or seriously injured.
Mhm. So obviously, funding is a big issue, and you've touched on it a little bit in your talk. But what are the key ways cities could pursue funding? Some of the key programs that exist out there that would be helpful for improving
Yeah.
their environments.
There's probably people in Phoenix that would have a better answer than me. You might be able to get some funding through your metropolitan planning organization, through different federal programs. There's, at the federal level now, we have a new administration. There's a grant program called Tiger. It's very competitive, but in the past has funded a lot of innovative urban transportation projects, including safety related projects. So that could be a good source as well. But I do think there needs to be more federal funding specifically for this. Like, I think that there should be a big pot of money that's just, we're having this pedestrian safety problem. We've got to get this under control, and here's a big pot of money that's available to cities who want to do something about this. I think one of the obstacles to addressing this is that a lot of the highway funding, the way the federal programs are structured, is more or less automatic, very few strings attached. But people that want to do something, like a city that wants to do something like better upgrade their bus stops, ADA work, or that Refuge Islands thing I use as an example, it's more difficult. They have to sort of piece together the funding. They have to be very motivated. They have to sort of fight against the current. So there's a need for federal reforms as well, I think.
So at the end, you talked about street lighting a bit. And how do you balance the need for street lighting for pedestrian safety? Because we know that dusk and the evening are the most dangerous times to be a pedestrian. How do you balance the needs for lighting for pedestrian safety with overall light pollution? Because one of the things is a lot of these very dangerous roads are, they're very wide, they're very fast, they're designed to be, they're designed to have high volume traffic. They're also what you'd consider a disamenity for living there. And if you can afford not to live near one, you don't live there, which is one of the reasons why lower income households are more likely to be affected by road traffic and the violence of being hit. And also, we also know of asthma and cardiovascular disease and other pollution associated with pollution. But just in the context of lighting, what are some of the considerations for balancing the needs of pedestrian safety with light pollution, so we don't make these already disamenity locations worse?
So I have to be honest that I'm not really an expert on that subject. I haven't looked at the issue of light pollution too closely. But one thing I would add is that street lighting has benefits for personal safety as well. In Detroit, that whole thing was not about pedestrian safety. That was just like a happy accident that it had such a big impact. It was really about improving people's personal safety, which was a big concern in Detroit. So you know what, I don't even want to, I'm sorry, I just don't want to say something that isn't right. I know that, like, in my case, they They did replace the streetlights in Cleveland recently with LEDs, and I thought that the light pollution actually improved a lot, that the light was much more focused down on the street compared to it used to shine right in my bedroom window every night. But a lot of people do complain about, they don't like the color of LED lights. Sometimes there's complaints about that. So I do think they have a lot of benefits, though, environmentally, again, personal safety, and then for pedestrian safety. So I do think it's worth looking at, and it's worth looking at also the equity of that. I know that they're trying to do an analysis in Atlanta that looks at how their lighting amenities are distributed from an equity standpoint, which I think is cool.
That is neat. So here's a question that builds on this equity issue, and I'm gonna read it verbatim, and then I fully understand it, so I'm gonna try and paraphrase as best I can. So if whoever asked this, I don't know who asked it, if they want to retype it into the chat, that would be great too. But the question is, privilege has been a repeating theme of your presentation. Please speak to the vocal minority of cyclists and the overall comfort of active transportation design standards. And I guess as I take this, there are certain groups of advocates for safe streets and such that in many ways they tend to skew younger white male people of privilege and so on. And it's not that their heart is in the wrong place, but how do we make sure that we have a coalition that actually reflects everybody rather than sort of this patriarchy of of concern. So I guess if you could talk to coalition building or issues of privilege within street safety or any of those issues.
Yeah, some of this stuff I'm not like, there's people who specialize in sort of equity and racial equity, and that's sort of their practice and so I don't want to present myself as that kind of person, because there are people that do that and know that better. I do think that critique is really right and has been raised a lot more lately, that cycling and safe streets advocates have not been inclusive enough in the way they define the problem and in who is able to sort of influence the debate and who's at the table. So it is a problem. It is a problem, and we have to do a better job. And I think like it's sort of always the struggle with progressive change. You have to put together a really diverse coalition, and there's always a potential for conflict, a potential for people, white people who are a little bit clueless. And I think like, all of us who are white are having to unlearn some bad lessons and at different stages on our journeys. And that's not to excuse at all when something insensitive happens, but we have a long way to go. And I do think it would be, if we could, people who are interested in bikes, if we could get them on a path where they're also unlearning some harmful things and becoming advocates for their neighbors who have different problems and need a little more help, that would be a really positive outcome potentially and beneficial on a lot of fronts.
Mm-hmm. So I guess building on that, another question came in about priorities. If you were, and you are in this position, you have a consulting firm and you're talking with people about this, what do you counsel in terms of priorities? Like, if we live in a world of constrained resources, cities have constrained finances, they can only do so much at any given time. So how should cities or states or MPOs or whoever think about these interventions that you've talked about in terms of priorities, in terms of start with this, then move to this, then move to that? Is it not possible to set priorities in a general way?
like I said, I think it's a very local issue, and I don't think you should apply like a one size fits all sort of approach because different neighborhoods will need different things. I do think it's best to focus on, like I mentioned, this is an issue that disproportionately affects neighborhoods of color, low income neighborhoods. So the resources should really be targeted towards populations that are at increased risk. And a lot of times there's been racism, those neighborhoods have been passed over for safety amenities that have already been provided for higher income neighborhoods. And that's part of the reason we have such a big problem with this, because the resources that are available aren't distributed equitably. So that's a problem. I do think that, I mentioned pedestrian leading intervals are a pretty cheap and easy one. That's sort of some low hanging fruit. I think they're, it's doesn't require any infrastructure in a lot of cases. You're just retiming traffic signals. So that's something to look at. Something to look at in some of your more dangerous intersections, I would say.
And there's been a few questions that have come through the chat that are asking about differences between rural and urban statistics. Within the statistics that you use, do you have any breakdown of rural versus urban? I would imagine that it's more dangerous if you get hit as a pedestrian in a rural lane because the speeds are going to be higher. I also imagine that these suburban areas of the Sun Belt cities where you have a lot of traffic and a fair number of walking are probably the most dangerous places.
Yeah, this is, I believe, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but it's more of an urban and suburban phenomenon. I do think people get killed occasionally in rural areas, but a lot more deaths happen in rural areas for drivers and passengers.
Mhm.
One thing I did sort of look at in the book, and I see there's another question sort of about this, with the disparity in the number of Native people being killed this way. One of the explanations for that seems to be that a lot people, Native people who live on tribal lands or reservations are in sort of a rural setting, but those communities might function in a little more traditional way, like a traditional village with a good amount of walking. And so, but we haven't made a special effort to provide the type of safety infrastructure that would be needed to make that safe. So people who are doing a lot of walking, living in tribal areas may have to cross. And I have an example that I use in my longer presentation, a very fast rural road that has no crosswalk. Obviously that can be extremely dangerous, but I didn't look real closely at the problem in a rural context because it's not where most of the deaths occur.
Okay. Well, we're up almost to 1 o'clock here, Mountain Time. So we have one last question. And I guess this gets back to sort of best practices, but you've been both sides of the media. And so do you have any tips on working with local media to clarify road violence and other issues and also support the sustainable intervention?
Yeah, I think that is an area where grassroots advocates, like probably a lot of people on this webinar, can be useful. A lot of times the media reporting is really a problem. It's really insensitive, and it contributes to this notion that it's sort of not a problem that lends itself to any type of solution. So I do think I know that the Arizona Republic actually did, and I know that the New Times have both done pretty serious investigations about this that were great. So maybe they don't need, at least the transportation reporters don't need any guidance, but a lot of times the television news can be guilty of this, and it's someone who just has been given a task that's supposed to take 15 minutes to report about one of these deaths. I mean, if you're on Twitter, if you know the reporter, usually an email is attached in the story. I do think it's good and okay to reach out to them and try to explain what the problem is. I can actually, there's a, I don't know if I have access to the chats, but I was going to say I can add a link. The Columbia Journalism Review wrote an article recently, or it was a few years ago, about warning reporters not to blame the victim in these cases. And I think that's a good thing to share. The Columbia Journalism Review is considered credible. And also the Associated Press has a little bit of guidance about this too. So I do think reaching out to the reporters, if you think they're doing something harmful, and politely trying to explain what the problem is worthwhile, is worth doing.
Great. Well, I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. It's just after 1 o'clock right now. So I would like to once again thank Angie Schmidt for being here. I thought this was a great talk. I have really enjoyed it. I know that I can see that some of my students have come. I'm glad that you were able to make it. Lauren Cubia has a link to Angie's book in the chat. You can buy it locally through Changing Hands Bookstore. If you use Schmidt as the discount code, you get 20% off, and that will be a few dollars very well spent. With that, I'd like to, again, thank Angie, and I believe I'm handing it back to Lauren for final words.
Okay, can I just say thanks to you guys? Yeah, thanks to everyone who came, and thank you for inviting me. I think it's really important to try and improve things in Arizona. So I'm supporting you in spirit from up here.